In this video, I'm going to be analysing the strengths and weaknesses of 3 biomechanical principles of my fourth role. Here I will be using angular momentum, balance and stability, and levers, and also will add my knowledge of anatomy to my analysis. In the preparation phase of my fourth role, a strength is that I rolled smoothly in sequence through the preparation and execution phase. This is because of flexion used throughout the body, which is neck flexion, spine flexion, hip flexion, and knee flexion. One of the most important use of flexion in the preparation phase is neck flexion. This is the movement of the neck, also known as a lever. A lever is a system made up of 3 parts: an effort, a load, and a fulcrum. In the human body, the effort is provided by the muscles. The load is the weight of the body and any additional resistance, and the fulcrum is the joint itself. There are 3 different types of levers: first-class lever, second-class lever, and third-class lever. The lever in the neck is also known as a first-class lever. The first-class lever is within the joint. The fulcrum is located on the lever in between the effort force and the load. An example of a first-class lever is a seesaw in the playground. In this case, my skull is the fulcrum, the muscles in the back of my neck provide the effort, and the weight of my head is the load. Going through the execution phase, my neck remains slightly flexed. When moving through the follow-through stage, my neck starts to extend back into its neutral position. I'm still using levers as my head is still the lever, but the muscles in my neck are now providing the force to lift my head back up into a neutral position against the weight of my load, which is my head. Neck is a synovial pivot joint and the only craniovertebral joint in the body, which is a joint that stops movement between the vertebral column and the skull. The pivot joint is a rounded bone formed by another bone and ligaments. In order to move the neck, the den articulates with the atlas and the axes and the ligaments of the neck. The neck is formed with many vertebrae called the cervical vertebrae. The vertebrae have cartilaginous discs between each vertebrae, which lubricates the joint and provides attachment for muscles and ligaments. The neck allows for movements such as flexion, extension, hyperextension, left to right rotation, and left to right lateral flexion. Biomechanical principle of levers and the neck joint is a strength in my forward roll, because if I didn't flex or extend my neck due to levers, then I would have highly likely injured my neck. Also, wouldn't have been able to smoothly roll through the different phases of my forward roll. Because of neck flexion and extension and the use of levers, I was able to smoothly roll into the execution phase. In the execution phase, I'm going to be analysing the biomechanical principle of angular momentum, which is a weakness in my forward roll. Angular momentum is a quantity of rotation of a body, which is a product of its movement of inertia and its angular velocity. The angular momentum of an object remains constant throughout a movement unless another force is acted upon it. This is a weakness because I wasn't able to give myself enough momentum to get into the follow-through stage and onto my feet without support. As shown in the video, I had to use my hands to help push me up from the ground. From analysing my forward roll, I started with a good downwards angular velocity. Angular velocity is the rate of change of an angular position of a rotating body, which is then transferred into angular momentum. I had a relatively tight tuck, which meant that all my limbs are close to my axes of rotation, which made me spin fast and smoothly. Angular momentum carried my body weight around my axes of rotation to complete the forward roll with additional force provided by my hands. This means that I had less rotational inertia. Rotational inertia is a body's resistance to change in the motion when rotating. This is because my mass was dispersed closer to my axes of rotation, meaning I had more angular velocity rather than rotational inertia. An important joint that is used during the execution phase is my spine. The spine is a cartilaginous joint. This is when bones are held together with cartilage. The vertebrae is a symphysis, which is when articulating bones are joined together by a disc, which is called cartilage, creating a slightly movable joint. The spine allows a movement of flexion, extension, lateral flexion, and circumduction. In my movement, my spine is flexing. The agnus muscle, which is shortening and contracting, is my rectus abdominis, and the antagonist muscle, which is a muscle that lengthens and relaxes, is the erectus spinae. There are 5 articulating bones around the spine, which are the cervical vertebrae, the thoracic vertebrae, the lumbar vertebrae, the sacrum, and the coccyx. From analysing the professional gymnast, I am able to see what I need to improve on to perfect my forwards roll. One important aspect I noticed was that I tucked too early. This meant I was at my fastest when rotating around my axes. As my limbs started to go away from my axes, my angular momentum and velocity decreased, meaning I had less angular momentum and velocity to help me smoothly go through to the follow-through phase. So I used the forces created from my wrist and arm muscles to help me stand upright. To improve my forwards roll, I am going to fully extend my legs when rotating around my axes. Then I'm going to tuck just after my body has rotated around my axes. By doing this, I will be at my fastest speed at the end of the execution phase, having enough angular momentum and velocity to help me stand upright. In the follow-through phase, I will be analysing the biomechanical principle of balance and stability, and how it was a strength in my forwards roll. I had enough angular momentum and velocity in the execution phase in order for my body to remain balanced and stable on my feet at the end, which is a strength in my movement. This body position is also known as an isometric contraction, which is no movement of a joint when tension is developed in the muscle. The aspects to be balanced and stable is a vital part to my movement. Balance is the ability to control your body without movement against gravity. Stability is your ability to control your body during a movement. In order for a body to be balanced and stable, it consists of three key parts. Your base of support, which is the area within the object's point of contact with the surface. Here you can see that my base of support is my feet, which are in contact with the ground, which my feet are about shoulder width apart, which allows me to stand stable. Another factor that influences this is my centre of gravity, which is the centre point of an object's mass at which the rest of the object is equally balanced. This point moves around when the body changes position. As you can see, my centre of gravity changes position during the different phases of my forwards roll. This is the point at which my body's mass is equally balanced. But to perfect this movement, another important aspect is line of gravity. This is a vertical line that passes through the centre of gravity to the ground, in order to determine the stability of an object. If the line of gravity falls within the base of support of the object, it's considered relatively stable. If the line falls outside of the base of support, the object is relatively unstable. As you can see, my line of support runs through my centre of gravity and lands within my base of support, which means that I am relatively stable. One joint used in the follow-through phase was my hip joint. The hip joint is a ball and socket synovial joint. The hip joint is the articulation of the pelvis with the femur, which connects the axial skeleton with the lower extremity, which allows the movement of abduction, adduction, lateral rotation, medial rotation, and what I'm using, flexion and extension. In this picture, you can see that my hips are flexed. This is because the muscles used in this movement work in pairs, which are called the antagonist and the agonist muscles. Agonist muscles are the muscles that shorten and contract during a movement, which you can't see from the angle in my video. But in hip flexion, the agonist muscles are the iliopsoas, the tensor fasciae latae, and the relaxing muscles are also known as the antagonist muscles, which are the gluteus maximus and the gluteus medius. These are the muscles that lengthen and relax. As the momentum behind my body forces me to stand upright, my hips start to extend, which means that my antagonistic muscles from my flexion phase turn into the contracting muscles, and my agnostic muscles become the relaxing muscles, as I move from flexion to extension of the hips. The hip joint played a very vital part in order for me to be balanced and stable in my ending position. Overall, my biomechanical principle of balance and stability was a huge strength for my movement, as I was able to perform a stable forwards roll and finish perfectly balanced. Because if I wasn't balanced or stable, I would have fallen over or stumbled onto my less stable side, meaning I would have unsuccessfully completed a forwards roll. Through analysing my skill next to a professional exemplar, it has shown me the improvements that I need to do in order to perfect the skill of a forwards roll.